All right, hello YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. Tonight, I wanted to put together a response to a contest that Pat over at the Ground Zero Salem YouTube channel has been running. Pat has, of course, a really interesting channel. He's a very cool guy, very knowledgeable. And his contest idea was to have people talk about albums where their opinion is kind of evolved over time. So, for example, maybe it was an album that you used to really love, but over the years you've lost interest in it, or now you don't think it's very good. Or perhaps it's an album you didn't care for at first, and as time went by, you grew to appreciate it, and now you think it's actually quite good. So it seemed like a very interesting topic. I liked watching Pat's original video about it. And I figured, yeah, I can put something together for that. It sounded pretty easy at first, but it did take some thought in terms of what album or albums do I want to talk about. Pat didn't specify a number of albums that people needed to discuss, or whether they were albums that they liked or disliked more as time went by. So I finally decided on doing a little bit of both. So I figured I'll pick 3 albums that I used to like. Now I'm less keen on. And I'd also pick 3 albums that I started out not really getting into, but now I really like. So without further ado, let's start with the ones that I used to be very high on, but time has kind of eaten away at those high reviews. This is always one of the things people worry about doing when they're reviewing an album or stating something like, I love it. And they come back to it later and it's just like, it's crap. But it happens to everyone. Things do change with time. Our tastes change with time. So it's not surprising this happens. Now, I decided to do this in PowerPoint mode just because I don't own copies of these albums that I don't like anymore, and it felt really weird to show only half the albums I was going to discuss. So we'll just do it in this format this time around. So let's start with something that I loved to death when I was a teenager. It is the first Slaughterhouse album, self-titled from 1990 on Metal Blade Records. If you have never seen or heard of this album, do not feel bad. It did not make many waves at the time. It is a New Jersey band, thrash band, very run-of-the-mill, nondescript by most standards. The reason I used to love this was I stumbled upon it at a local flea market when I was about 15 or maybe 16 years old. So it would have been right around 1990, maybe 91. Yeah, just somebody with, boxes and boxes of tapes, the kind of stuff that looked like it had, fallen off the back of a truck. And I was flipping through them looking for anything that seemed metal. And I saw this tape. I had never heard of this band, but looking at the name, the cover, it was on Metal Blade. I'm like, it's got to be heavy metal. They were only charging like $5 a tape. And so this was a total blind buy. I'm like, sure, I'll take a chance on it. Took it home and played it and loved it to death. I played this album 100 times while I was still in high school. You go back and revisit it these days and it's like, yeah, boy, there's not much there. The very nondescript name and cover art really does give you some hints about what you're getting into here. It's, the vocals are okay. They're kind of, in a gruff, hoarse kind of delivery. The music is relatively simple by thrash standards. It sticks to very mid-pace. There's not a lot of really fast or intricate riffing. It kind of just chugs along for the most part. Gets a little faster in some parts, but mostly it's pretty mid-tempo stuff. So yeah, this is not going to impress anybody who has much of a thrash metal pedigree. But when you're 15 years old, you don't have much of a thrash metal pedigree. And every album that you're hearing sounds new and interesting and fantastic. And that's what Slaughterhouse was to me. So yeah, this is something that I loved to death back in high school. But as the years went by and I built up, that repertoire of thrash metal albums, those got played more and more, and Slaughterhouse got played less and less. Currently, I don't even own a copy of this anymore, and it's not really something I would look to pick back up. It was a fun album for that time in my life. And I'll always have a bit of a soft spot for it because it was part of the soundtrack to my high school years. But it hasn't aged well. It's not really that strong of an album when once you know the wider world of thrash. This very much falls into that category of kind of second tier thrash where the scene had gotten very bloated, very oversaturated by this point. This was the kind of album where, yeah, too many bands were being rushed to put out albums to ride the popularity of thrash, and the quality suffered a bit. Slaughterhouse did get one more release on Metal Blade. They were not a one and done band. The following year, they put out this one, Face Reality, which if you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. I kind of like, the really cheesy, low grade Metal Blade cover art. But this one's maybe a little tighter and more focused than the debut. The problem with this album is it came out in the same year as the Black Album. It came out in the same year as Nevermind and 10. This album never had a chance in 1991. There was no way this band was going to get any attention then. So not a horrible band. I kind of like them. When I think of them, those be like, oh yeah, that was kind of fun back then. But yeah, if I had to review or give an honest opinion on it these days, not the best stuff around anymore. All right, so my second pick for an album that I've cooled down a lot on over the years is this one, Iron Maiden's No Prayer for the Dying, their 1990 release. This is one, again, for me, there's some sentimental attachment because this was the first new Iron Maiden album that came out once I was into heavy metal. I got into heavy metal in that window in between Seventh Son of a Seventh Son and the release of No Prayer for the Dying. Now, this was not my first exposure to Iron Maiden. By the time this came out, I had already heard, I'm pretty sure I'd heard the first two albums with Paul Di'Anno on vocals, and I had also heard the Live After Death double live album. So I already had a decent introduction to Iron Maiden by the time this came out. I was very excited when it got released. It was really cool to be able to go out and buy a new Iron Maiden album for the first time. And I liked it. It had some fun songs on it. I liked Tail Gunner. Was it a little repetitive? Yeah, but it was still a catchy, upbeat, energetic kind of number. It had Holy Smoke, which was a cool track and still is. And, a few others that I liked. I did recognize that it was not the strongest album start to finish, that some songs were a little dull. Some never really held my interest. I'm thinking of tracks like Running Silent, Running Deep, and Assassin. It also had some songs that were a little too cheesy for their own good, things like Hooks and You and Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. But overall, again, I'm like 15, 16 years old. This is my first Iron Maiden new purchase. I bought it and I played the heck out of it, and I liked it just fine. Thank you very much. Over the years, it's gotten less and less and less play. Once I had the entire Iron Maiden discography filled in, it becomes obvious this is not one of their better albums. In fact, it's one of their weakest albums. It's certainly the weakest one they released prior to Virtual 11. Again, I will always have some sentimental attachment to it because of the time and place I heard it and where it fit in with me in my metal experience. There are times it's like, well, maybe, is this better than Somewhere in Time? As some of you who watch my channels and the Heavy Metallurgy live stream know, I'm not a huge fan of Somewhere in Time, but no, that is a better album than this one for sure. Going back and trying to replay this one these days, again, you get Tail Gunner and Holy Smoke, and after that, you really gotta pick and sift through the wreckage to try to find some tracks that are good. So No Prayer for the Dying is definitely slid way, way down in the rankings over time, and it's one of the lower ones in the Iron Maiden catalog these days. All right, third and last album that I'm going to pick for the albums I've cooled off on over time is this one. It's The Book by the Czech band Root. This was released in 1999. This one, when it came out, I was pretty blown away. I thought the band had a very interesting, unique, and original sound. The album had good musicianship. It had a very unique vocalist with Big Boss. It had sort of a very unique kind of dark aura about it without being, doom metal or without being black metal. So yeah, it just kind of did everything right. And I thought quite highly of the album. I followed the band for years, picked up, their next several albums as they came out. And this one, it's not a case where I think the album is a lot worse now when I revisit it. It's still a pretty good album, but it is one that I've cooled off on a lot. This is not an album or a band really that I'm going to rant and rave about today the way I would have 20 some years ago when this was first coming out. And when like the following album, Black Seal, came out, that one I thought was spectacular. And so the band had kind of gone from strength to strength. I liked some of the albums from the the book years. I didn't like all of their earlier albums. They were a little hit or miss, but there were some. Temple of the Underworld was pretty cool. But yeah, I also felt, one thing that hurt this band, they kind of lost their way around Madness of the Graves. It just seemed like the atmospheres kind of fell apart. The albums, they didn't get horrible, but they really didn't have much interesting on them after that. And the band ended up on hiatus for a long time. I'm not even sure what their current status is. And I don't really care enough to look into it, which kind of tells you where I'm at with Root at this point. So again, this is not a bad album. I'd still give this album a thumbs up. I would still like it. I still play it once in a while. But that's a significant step down from where this was at for me in the early 2000s, where I would play this album very regularly and really touted this very highly as a very strong, cool, unique, and dynamic album. So still a good one. I'm not trying to trash the album or anything here, but my opinion has definitely evolved from being like, wow, mind blown, to yeah, good album. I check it out from time to time. Okay, so those have been three albums that my opinion has evolved kind of downwards over time. So now let's change gears and talk about a few albums where my opinion has evolved such that I like the album a lot more than I used to. And we'll start off with a classic here. Never mind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols by Sex Pistols, originally released in 1977. I first heard this one, let's see, I got it as a cassette tape for Christmas. I think it was probably my senior year of high school, so give or take a year. And the first time I heard this, it was interesting because even though it was dumb high school teenager, I remember very distinctly having one of those kind of level up in maturity moments because I put this in the Walkman, was listening through it, paying attention, all of that. And I remember getting maybe a third of a way through side two. So I got through the first side, was working on side two, and I didn't really care for it much at all. But I remember distinctly thinking to myself that I'm just not ready to hear this album because I was strictly into heavy metal at that point. I had not really listened to much, if any, punk music. This is several years before Green Day showed up and saved punk music and brought it back, to a popular forefront. Nobody at my high school or in my social circles really listened to punk music, so I had zero exposure to that style. And here I am listening to kind of one of the albums that started it all, and so I just didn't get it. But I recognized that I didn't get it. I was like, this album, I'm just not ready to hear it. I probably played the cassette tape a couple more times, but I already knew it's just like this isn't the right time for me to try to understand Sex Pistols. So I ended up trading the tape away probably pretty soon after that. Eventually, I came back around to this album years later, once I had kind of expanded my listening repertoire a bit and checked out some other punk things. understood more about where punk fit into the greater scheme of heavy and extreme music, and revisited this album. And then it started to make a lot more sense. It's like, okay, this is pretty cool. I get it now, because I was at a point in my life where I could start to understand and appreciate what they were doing and what they were singing about. So yeah, never mind the bollocks. I'm never going to be someone who, as this is like, best album ever. Punk music, it's interesting to me. I don't know a ton of it. I know a little bit about it here and there, but at the end of the day, I'm a headbanger, not a punk guy. But this is a good album. I like it. This is one I will actually play on a semi-regular basis, at least once or twice. The musicianship's very good. It's very interesting. It's an important historical artifact, but the music on it is actually really good too. So it's got a kind of winning combination there. And there's a lot of tracks on it that I dig quite a bit. So yeah, it took some time. I had to do some growing up and gain some more experience listening to other types of music outside of just what was popular in heavy metal in the late 80s and early 90s before I could really wrap my head around Nevermind the Bollocks and really appreciate it. But yeah, cool album that big thumbs up nowadays. All right, another one that I've come to like a lot more than I used to is the first self-titled album from Danzig, released in 1988. I discovered this album in kind of a weird way. I read about it in one of those horrible teeny bopper metal tiger heartthrob beat magazines that you used to see in the grocery stores with, pictures of Sebastian Bach with his shirt unbuttoned on the cover. Now, before we pass any judgments, let me explain. You have to remember, this is like, the tail end of the 80s, earliest, maybe 1990. I was growing up in a very small rural southern town. You had very limited access to information about heavy metal stuff. You didn't get Metal Maniacs because there was no Metal Maniacs. You couldn't hop on the internet and check things out. You got Headbangers Ball if you were allowed to sit up late to watch it on MTV, midnights on Saturdays. And you had whatever happened to be in these horrible glossy magazines at the grocery store that were clearly aimed at trying to get, young girls to cut out pictures and pin them up, on their wall for bands like Cinderella and Warrant and stuff like that. But every now and then, one of those magazines would cover a couple of more serious heavy metal bands. And to be very clear, also, it was usually my sister that was buying these, and I would just read her issues. So I get at least a little credit for not spending my own money on them. Maybe that's all the credit I get, but I get a little bit, at least a little bit. But yeah, every now and then, in between the entries on Enough is Enough and Brittany Fox and all these bands, there'd be a story about Overkill. I found out about Overkill, Years of Decay, in one of those magazines. And I also found out about Danzig in one of those magazines. They had just, a simple 2-page spread, big picture of Danzig with the mic, and it gave like a quick bio rundown of his background. And I was really amazed because it's talking about, this guy was like, in Misfits and Sam Hain. These were names I had heard. I had not heard any music by those bands at that point, but I at least knew the names. It's like, holy crap, I didn't realize this guy was tied into all these other sort of big name bands. And they described his singing style as this kind of, like, dark, evil Elvis. And I thought that sounded like a really cool, interesting description. I, grown up listening to a lot of 50s and 60s music. I liked Elvis. Elvis was a good singer. So it was like, wow, a heavy metal Elvis, looking at the guy, that description is like, I got to check this out. That sounds pretty cool. So fast forward several weeks into the future where we finally got to a city big enough to have a record store. I picked up the first Danzig album on cassette. It looked kind of interesting. Got it back in the trusty Walkman, gave it a play, and really didn't like it on first impression. So it's like, hey, boy, did I just waste $8? Man, I could have eaten lunch this past week. I don't know about this. But again, I'd spent $8 on it. And it was the only tape, my one tape purchase for the month. It'd be another month before we got back to any place with her record store. So I wasn't giving up on it that easy. So play it again a couple of times. Now, the song Mother stood out pretty quickly. It's like, okay, it's at least got this one track on it. So after the first couple of listens, my impression was it's a one song wonder. It's got this cool song Mother, and the rest of this I don't know about. But then another track would stick. It's like, actually, Twist of Cain's pretty cool. I like this gnarly guitar line they've got in it. That's very catchy. I'd catch myself humming it and everything. So it's like, okay, I can get into this one. Not bad. Play it a few more times and another song would stick. Gradually, probably over a course of weeks and months, I got to the point where it's like, well, okay, I like most of one side. Side A is kind of cool, but it fades down the stretch. But I just kind of kept playing it. Eventually, I also got I liked it enough that I did end up getting Danzig 2, Lucifuge, and this was probably at least a couple years later. And I really liked that album. Now, that one clicked with me very quickly, and that encouraged me to go back and play Danzig 1 some more. So it's like, okay, replays like, this is a little better than I remember. Okay, yeah, I liked all these songs, but some of these others aren't so bad. And it just was this, kind of process of very gradually appreciating it one song at a time. By the time Danzig 3 came out, I got that, How the Gods Kill, instantly loved a lot of that record. So again, pulled Danzig 1 back out and gave it some more listens. And eventually got to the point where, I like most of this album. Almost every track is pretty good. It's still probably my least favorite of those first 3 albums, but it's a strong album. I absolutely like it quite a bit now. One of the take-home messages from this is, don't give up on an album too quickly. And the reason I didn't give up on this album so quickly, as I explained, back in the day, you may have only gotten to buy 1 or 2 albums a month. And so that was it. You couldn't just delete it, move on, and check out the next band on Spotify or the next thing on YouTube. This was it. This was what I had new to listen to for weeks. So by God, I'm going to listen to it. And that gave it time to start to sink in, for me to start to wrap my head around it and start to appreciate it for what it was. And I do think that's something that we're all very bad not to do in this day and age. It's happened to every music collector as time goes by and you're listening to more stuff and you're picking stuff up more rapidly. You're getting in these massive tape trades and these massive CDR trades and hitting record shows where you may buy a dozen things at a time, 2 dozen things at a time. I may have bought 3 or 4 or 5 dozen things at a time on a few occasions. You just can't digest the music the same way you could when you are getting only 1 or 2 things at a time. And so, we probably all miss out on some really cool albums because we just don't give them the time that they need and deserve to really sink in with us. And this first Danzig album is a good example of how much that can pay off if you're patient and give the album the repetitions it needs to really let it start to sink in and click with you. All right, we've got one last one that, in my opinion, evolved in a positive fashion over time. And for this last entry, I've chosen the Gates of Slumber's Conqueror album from 2008. This was my introduction to Gates of Slumber, doom metal band from the Midwest. They had done a couple albums before this, but I had not even heard the band's name. But when this one came out, I caught wind of it. I'm pretty sure it was via MySpace. So this would have been prime MySpace era kind of stuff. And they had one song posted that I liked quite a bit. I'm pretty sure it was Iceworm. It's like, that's a pretty cool song. Okay. Kind of a doomy thing, working in that kind of, Manila Road style a little slightly. I can dig it. Let's track this down. And I did, ordered a copy, and, played it a few times, but a lot of the songs didn't click with me much at first. Iceworm was cool. I liked Trapped in a Web. The title track was decent, but other than those 3, nothing was really doing too much for me. And it kind of started to fall into the category of, well, kind of a generic second-rate doom metal thing. It's not bad, but whatever. But I thought the band was at least interesting enough that I kind of kept tabs on them. And I ended up coming across a couple of their other releases here and there. An EP, they had a split. I'd pick them up, and they always were kind of interesting. They had good taste in cover songs that they would include here and there. And I started to realize that, yeah, this album's pretty good. Would come back to Conqueror, play it. I was just like, okay, no, this is actually pretty solid. And so over, a few years, getting more exposure to the band, and again, just coming back to this album. This one didn't go to the shelf and collect dust for 5 years and get forgotten. It would come back off the shelf every couple of months, get a few more spins, make a little more sense. And I came to realize that, yeah, this is actually a really solid slab of newer doom. Can get into it just fine. The band did better albums later on. I think, Hymns of Blood and Thunder is probably better than this one. I went backwards and checked out their first two albums. Both of the first two albums have some very cool songs on them, but at the same time, they show a lot of signs of a band trying to find their feet. But, Conqueror's the album where it feels like everything really did start to gel. The band unfortunately eventually fell apart. They had some lineup issues. They had some, substance abuse issues. Member unfortunately passed away. Now, I believe the band is currently active once again. I haven't really followed up on that, so I don't know the details at this point. But if so, that's cool to see that some of them are working on new material again. But yeah, this is a good example of where you can't let the album just go to the shelf and get lost, which again is something that I think a lot of us are bad to do. You download a bunch of stuff, play it a couple of times, and then it's lost in a folder. And we just, instead of going and flipping back through that folder, we go download more stuff. We listen to more stuff on YouTube. Things get buried very rapidly, but if you keep them close to the surface, circle back around to them sometimes, it gives them a chance to grow on you and you can start to really latch on. So that was the lesson in here. Don't let those albums get buried on the shelf. Which, yeah, even to this day is something I'm still bad to do, even though I know from examples like this one, I shouldn't let that happen. Okay, that is going to wrap up my examples for Pat's video. So now let's talk metal in the comments down below. What are some albums that your opinion has evolved on over time? What's something that you used to love and now you just aren't into it anymore? Or what are some things that you didn't like at first, but grew to love as time went by? For this video and my choices, I tried to skip some of the really easy, low-hanging fruit, ancient hair metal bands that we all know now suck, but maybe we listened to when we were 13 or 14, stuff like that. So yeah, leave a comment below. Let me know which albums you picked for this, or better yet, go over to Pat's channel at Ground Zero Salem and post your reply there. Send him an email, make your own video, and enter his contest. I think you have until the end of March 2022 to get your entry submitted to him. I would double check the date. It's been a while since I watched Pat's original video. I may be just missing the deadline myself with this. If I do, that's okay. It was still a cool video to make, and glad I could contribute, even if it was a bit last second here. All right, with that, let's wrap everything up for the evening. As always, everybody take care, and keep banging your head.